You ever stand on the shore, staring out at the gray, endless water, and get that feeling? That prickle on the back of your neck like something ancient is staring back from just beneath the waves? Most people shake it off, blame the wind or the vastness. Me? I inherited the place where those feelings are born. I inherited St. Augustine's reach, and the chilling truth that the sea doesn't just keep secrets, sometimes it demands sacrifices. They say the sea keeps its secrets. Down where the light doesn't reach, things fester. Old things. Things that have learned patience. I never much believed in secrets, not the spooky kind anyway. People kept secrets, sure. Money troubles, affairs, petty grudges. But the world? The world just was. Rocks, water, wind. Predictable, mostly. Brutal sometimes, yeah, but not malicious. Not until I inherited the Lighthouse. St. Augustine's reach. Sounds grander than it is. It wasn't some stately brick tower from a postcard. It was a squat, iron beast bolted onto a jagged finger of rock called the Widow's Tooth, maybe a mile off the coast. My Great-Uncle Elias had been the keeper there for nigh on 40 years. Reclusive old bastard, apparently. I'd met him maybe twice in my life, both times at funerals where he'd smelled faintly of salt and unspoken regrets. When the lawyer called, I was working a dead-end data entry job in a city that had long since sucked the color out of my life. Elias had passed. Heart attack, they said. Alone in the tower. And he'd left the whole damn thing, the lighthouse, the rock, the little mainland supply cottage, to me, his only living relative, save for some distant cousins who probably didn't even know he existed. My first thought? Sell it. Fast. Who the hell wants a lighthouse, especially one decommissioned years ago, only kept running out of some historical preservation grant Elias had apparently charmed out of the government? It was a relic, a rusty monument to obsolescence. But the lawyer mentioned the stipend. The preservation grant came with a yearly sum, not huge, but enough to live on modestly, provided the light was maintained according to the original charter. Maintained manually. Elias, it seemed, had fought tooth and nail against automation. Part of the deal. Sell it, and the grant vanished. Keep it running, and, well, it wasn't data entry. It was isolation, sure, but maybe the kind I needed. A clean break. The lawyer handed me a thick, oilskin-wrapped packet along with the keys. Elias left instructions, he'd said, his tone dry. Specific ones. Part of the charter agreement, apparently. The journey out was rough. A hired boatman, a grizzled local named Finn with eyes like chipped sea glass, took me and a month's worth of supplies. He didn't say much, just spat tobacco juice into the churning gray water and occasionally grunted about the currents around the tooth. Place has teeth of its own, he mumbled as the lighthouse loomed into view, stark against the bruised sky. Best watch yourself. The lighthouse was grim. Salt had eaten into the iron, leaving weeping rust trails. The lower levels smelled of damp stone, machine oil, and something else, something vaguely fishy but deeper, more mineral. Elias had kept it functional, but not comfortable. A cramped galley, a bunk room barely bigger than a closet, and the watch room just below the lantern room itself. Everything was coated in a fine layer of salt spray. That first night, after Finn had unceremoniously dumped my gear and left me alone on the rock, I opened the oilskin packet. Inside wasn't just a manual for the lamp mechanism, a beautiful, archaic clockwork and lens system, but a handwritten ledger titled The Keeper's Duties and Observations. Elias's script was tight, spidery, obsessive. Most of it was technical, oiling schedules, wick trimming procedures, log entries about weather. But interspersed were other rules. Rules that had nothing to do with maritime safety. Duty 1. The lamp must never extinguish between the hours of sundown and sunrise. Fuel levels are secondary to the continuity of the light. If the mechanism fails, use the auxiliary whale oil burners. Fire is life. Duty 4. Polish the Fresnel lens daily, before noon. Use only rainwater collected in the cistern, mixed with salt scraped from the eastern gallery rail. Impurities anger the glass. Duty 7. During fog thicker than milk, sound the horn in sequences of 3 long blasts, followed by 1 short, then silence for precisely 7 minutes. Repeat until the fog lifts. The pattern must be observed. Duty 11. If scraping sounds are heard on the lower ironwork during high tide, especially under a new moon, do not investigate. Ensure the lower hatch is bolted from within. Some things are best left unfed. Duty 14. Never look directly into the lamp's beam as it rotates. Its heart is not for mortal eyes. Duty 16. If the sea birds fall silent suddenly, extinguish all lights except the main lamp. Remain in the watchroom until they sing again. Silence invites. There were more, nearly 30 in total. Some were mundane. Keep the galley stores secured against vermin. Others utterly bizarre. Burn dried seaweed, not driftwood, and the stove during winter solstice week. The scent placates. I laughed, nervously at first. Old Elias had clearly gone round the bend. Cabin fever, salt air, too much time alone. It was quaint, in a creepy way. I figured I'd follow the actual maintenance rules for the grant and ignore the superstitious nonsense. How hard could it be? Keep the light turning, polish the glass, don't fall off the rock. The first week was peaceful, almost disappointingly so. I got into a rhythm. Wake, check the lamp mechanism, clean, make coffee, polish the lens, using tap water, thank you very much, not salt scrapings, read, check the weather instruments, eat, prepare the lamp for the night, light it at dusk, read some more, sleep. The rhythmic sweep of the beam across my bunk room wall became a strange sort of lullaby. The isolation was profound, but cleansing. No emails, no deadlines, just the sea and the sky and the steady, ticking heart of the lighthouse. I ignored duty 11 when I heard faint scraping sounds during a high tide. Probably just debris, or a loose bit of metal. I ignored duty 16 when the gulls circling the tower abruptly went silent one afternoon. They probably just spotted a fishing boat. I used regular distilled water for the lens, not rainwater and salt. Nothing happened. Elias was just a crazy old coot. The first weird thing happened about 10 days in. It was a calm night, stars like spilled diamonds on black velvet. I was in the watchroom, reading, the clockwork mechanism ticking softly behind me. Suddenly, the ticking stopped. Silence crashed down, heavy and absolute. Even the distant sigh of the waves seemed to cease. My heart hammered. I spun around. The giant gears were still. The lamp, halfway through its rotation, was frozen, casting a stark, unmoving beam out into the blackness. Panic seized me. Duty 1. The lamp must never extinguish between sundown and sunrise. Elias's frantic script flashed in my mind. Okay, mechanism failure. Annoying, but manageable. I grabbed the heavy crank handle used for manual winding and emergencies. I put my weight into it, expecting resistance, the feel of gears refusing to mesh. It turned freely. Too freely. Like it wasn't connected to anything. Sweat beaded on my forehead. I checked the weights, huge iron cylinders that drove the clockwork. They were fully wound, hanging high. I checked the gears visually. Nothing looked broken, jammed, or out of place. It was just stopped. Use the auxiliary whale oil burners. Whale oil? Seriously? I scrambled down the ladder to the storage level. Tucked away in a dusty corner, behind barrels of kerosene, were indeed several canisters of thick, viscous oil and a set of old-fashioned burners designed to fit inside the lens housing. Reluctantly, feeling ridiculous, I hauled one up. Getting the main lamp mechanism disengaged and the burners in place was a frantic, greasy business. My hands shook. The silence of the tower pressed in. When I finally lit the wicks, the oily smoke filled the lantern room, the flames casting flickering, uncertain light through the magnificent lens. It wasn't the powerful, sweeping beam of before, but it was light. Continuous light. As the first, smoky beam completed a shaky rotation, the clockwork mechanism behind me groaned, shuddered, and then, with a definitive clunk, started ticking again. The gears began to turn. The main lamp assembly began its slow, majestic sweep. Heart-pounding, I quickly extinguished the oil burners, the smell clinging to my clothes and hair. I re-engaged the main lamp. It worked perfectly. Smooth, silent, steady. As if it had never stopped. I leaned against the cool glass of the lantern room, breathing heavily. Coincidence? A temporary jam. Something just needed a jolt. That had to be it. But as I looked down at the dark, swirling water surrounding the widow's tooth, a nagging thought surfaced. The mechanism hadn't just stopped. Everything had stopped. The waves, the wind, even, I realized with a chill, the sound of my own breathing in my ears had seemed momentarily suspended. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The rhythmic sweep of the beam now felt less like a lullaby and more like a searching eye. And every creak of the old iron structure sounded like footsteps on the stairs. That strange night with the lamp was a turning point. Before, the lighthouse was a rusty, isolated shell, and the ledger was a joke. Now, the tower felt less like a building and more like a piece of intricate, sleeping machinery. And Elias's rules were the operating manual. I'd accidentally ignored one and the machine had stalled. Now, I found myself wondering, what would happen if I deliberately followed one? The lamp incident left me rattled, but determined not to give in to Elias's apparent paranoia. I redoubled my efforts to stick to a rational routine. Mechanical failures happen, especially in old, salt-corroded structures. End of story. But the rules kept nagging at me. Particularly Duty 4, polish the Fresnel lens daily. Use only rainwater collected in the cistern, mixed with salt scraped from the eastern gallery rail. I'd been using distilled water from my supplies. The lens seemed fine, sparkling clean. What difference could it possibly make? Curiosity, or maybe just a perverse desire to prove Elias wrong, got the better of me. The next morning, a bright, blustery day, I climbed out onto the narrow gallery surrounding the lantern room. The wind whipped at my jacket, and the sea crashed against the rocks far below. On the eastern rail, facing the sunrise, the iron was thick with encrusted salt, sculpted by years of spray. Using my utility knife, I scraped a small amount of the coarse, grayish crystals into a tin cup. Then I went down to the cistern in the base of the tower, a dark, echoing space that collected rainwater from the roof. Mixing the gritty salt with the slightly brackish rainwater felt like performing some arcane ritual. When I applied the mixture to the huge, multifaceted lens, it felt different. Not just cleaning, but almost like feeding it. The glass seemed to drink in the salty water, and when I buffed it dry, the light refracting through it seemed sharper, purer, almost alive. Impurities anger the glass. Ridiculous. It was just salt acting as a mild abrasive. Nothing more. That night, however, the beam seemed brighter. Its edge cut through the darkness with a clarity I hadn't noticed before. Or maybe I was just imagining things, my mind primed by Elias's madness. A few days later, the fog rolled in. Not the gentle mist I'd seen before, but a thick, wet, suffocating blanket that swallowed the lighthouse whole. Visibility dropped to zero. The world beyond the gallery rail ceased to exist. Duty 7, during fog thicker than milk, sound the horn in sequences of 3 long blasts, followed by 1 short, then silence for precisely 7 minutes. The foghorn was a compressed air beast, housed in a small shed on the rock near the base of the tower, operated by a lever in the watchroom. I'd tested it once. The sound was deafening, a mournful, gut-vibrating drone. 3 long, 1 short. 7 minutes silence. Repeat. Why that specific pattern? It made no nautical sense. Standard fog signals were different. This was deliberate. A code? A warning? Remembering the stalled lamp, I took no chances. I started the sequence. The first 3 blasts echoed out, swallowed instantly by the fog. Then the silence. 7 minutes. It felt like an eternity. My skin crawled. I found myself straining to hear something through the oppressive quiet, something responding. Nothing. Just the muffled sound of the waves, seeming miles away. I repeated the pattern. 3 long. 1 short. Silence. Again. And again. 4 hours. As dusk approached, the fog remained, thick as wet wool. The lamp beam was useless, barely penetrating a few feet beyond the glass. The horn became the lighthouse's only voice. It was sometime after midnight, maybe my 30th repetition of the cycle, during the 7 minutes of silence, that I heard it. Faintly at first, through the thick fog, from out on the water. Singing. It wasn't human singing. Not exactly. It was high-pitched, ethereal, a multi-layered harmony that seemed to weave itself out of the fog and the sea spray. It was beautiful, achingly so, but there was an undercurrent to it, something cold and predatory. It made the hair on my arms stand on end. It promised ecstasy and oblivion in the same breath. My hand froze on the foghorn lever. The 7 minutes were almost up. Duty 16, if the sea birds fall silent suddenly. No, that wasn't it. Wait, there was another rule I'd skimmed, thinking it irrelevant. I fumbled for the ledger, my hand slick with sweat. Duty 19, should singing be heard from the water during heavy fog whilst the horn is sounded, cease the pattern at once. Maintain absolute silence within the tower until the singing fades entirely. Do not, under any circumstances, look out from the lantern room or watchroom windows. Their eyes can pierce the veil. Their eyes? The singing grew louder, closer. It seemed to be coming from all directions now, swirling around the tower. It seeped through the iron walls, resonated in the stone floor. It was hypnotic. I felt a strange compulsion to go up to the lantern room, to peer out into the fog, to see the source of that unearthly music. Do not look out. I forced myself away from the watchroom window, my knuckles white as I gripped the railing of the spiral staircase. I descended, fumbling in the near darkness. The main lamp still swept its now useless beam overhead, the clockwork ticking relentlessly. The singing intensified, filling the enclosed space, vibrating in my teeth. I reached the lower hatch, the heavy iron door leading out onto the rock base. Elias's rule: ensure the lower hatch is bolted from within. I checked the heavy bolts. Secure. Then came the scraping. Duty 11, if scraping sounds are heard on the lower ironwork. It wasn't high tide, but the scraping was undeniable. A wet, slithering sound mixed with a sharp, chitinous clicking. Right outside the hatch. The singing reached a fever pitch, weaving around the scraping sounds, a horrifying counterpoint. I huddled in the cramped galley, hands clamped over my ears, eyes squeezed shut. But the sound wasn't just external. It felt like it was inside my head, pulling me, promising something. Release? Understanding? I fought the urge to unbolt the hatch, to just look. How long it lasted, I don't know. Minutes? Hours? Time seemed to warp in the presence of that sound. But eventually, slowly, agonizingly, the singing began to recede. The scraping faded. The silence that returned was different. Not the heavy, waiting silence of before, but a clean, empty silence. Shaking, I unclasped my hands from my ears. The only sound was the steady ticking of the clockwork above. The foghorn remained silent. I waited. Maybe another hour. The fog outside began to thin slightly, turning from opaque white to a translucent gray. I could just make out the pre-dawn light. Cautiously, I climbed back up to the watchroom. The sea was still shrouded, but the oppressive thickness was gone. And the silence held. Sunrise came, weak and watery through the remaining mist. The lamp mechanism ticked on faithfully. I hadn't looked out. I had kept silent. I had, unintentionally at first, then deliberately, followed Elias's insane rules. As the fog finally burned off under the morning sun, revealing a calm, gray sea, I went out onto the gallery for air. My legs still felt weak. And there, on the eastern gallery rail, where I scraped the salt, were marks. Long, deep gouges in the iron, running vertically. Too far apart for human fingers. Too sharp for claws I recognized. They looked almost like something had tried to climb the sheer iron face of the lighthouse, using the rail as a handhold, and failed to find purchase. And nestled in the corroded ironwork near the base of the lantern room glass, something glinted. I picked it up. A scale. Large as my thumb, iridescent like oil on water, yet hard as ceramic and razor sharp along one edge. It felt cold, unnaturally so, even in the sunlight. I looked out at the empty sea. Whatever had been singing, whatever had been scraping, it had been close. Close enough to touch. Close enough to leave a piece of itself behind. Elias wasn't just paranoid. He was terrified. And now, so was I. The scale wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't a strangely shaped shell or a bit of sea glass. It was real, hard, and terrifyingly organic. I kept it on the small desk in the watchroom, where it seemed to absorb the light, gleaming with a cold, oily luster. It was my anchor to this new, terrible reality. Elias wasn't mad, he was a gatekeeper. And now, I was. The scale changed everything. It was proof, cold and sharp in my hand, that Elias's rules weren't the ramblings of a lunatic. They were a defense. A set of rituals designed to keep something at bay. But what? And why the lighthouse? I devoured Elias's ledger again, this time not with skepticism, but with a desperate need for understanding. His later entries, the ones from the last decade of his life, were more erratic, filled with cryptic observations and underlined warnings. October 14th, the pattern held them off tonight. Fog was thick. Their song was stronger. Feel them getting bolder. Or perhaps I am weakening. December 3rd, new moon high tide. Scraping was furious. Felt the iron vibrate. Did not go down. Must not go down. Hunger must not be answered. February 21st, the glass seems displeased. Bean flickered thrice tonight. Used the salt water wash. Appeased? Or merely waiting? June 9th, saw one. Just a glimpse, through the spray during the storm. Too many limbs. Eyes like embers. God forgive me, I almost looked. His fear bled through the ink. But fear of what? He never named it. Just them, it, the singers, the scrapers. And then there were the entries about the light itself. He wrote about it not just as a machine, but as a living entity. The lamp's heart beats strong tonight. It watches. Or the light weakens. It feels the strain. Needs more than oil. I started following the rules meticulously. Rainwater and salt for the lens. The bizarre foghorn pattern. Never looking into the beam. Checking the lower hatch bolts nightly. Burning seaweed on the solstice, which thankfully wasn't for months yet. It felt like walking a tightrope, each rule a careful step away from an unseen abyss. The strangeness didn't stop, but it seemed contained. I'd hear faint singing on foggy nights, but it stayed distant as long as I kept silent during the horn's pauses. Scraping sounds came with the highest tides, but the bolts held. The lighthouse felt less like a refuge and more like a besieged fortress. My supplies were dwindling. Finn was due in 2 days for the monthly run. Part of me craved the human contact, the temporary return to normalcy. Another part dreaded explaining, well, anything. How do you tell a gruff boatman you think sea monsters are trying to climb your lighthouse? The night before Finn was due, the biggest storm I'd experienced yet rolled in. The sea turned into a thrashing black chaos, waves exploding against the widow's tooth, sending spray clear over the lantern room. The wind screamed like a banshee, and the entire tower groaned and shuddered. Duty 1, the lamp must never extinguish. I checked the mechanism constantly. The clockwork ticked on, but the wind's force against the lantern room glass was tremendous. I worried the structure itself might fail. Around 3 a.m., amidst the howling wind and crashing waves, I heard it again. Scraping. Louder than ever before, a frantic, tearing sound against the iron base. Mixed with it was a horrible, wet clicking, like giant insects chattering. I checked the lower hatch bolts. They were vibrating under the assault. One of the bolt heads seemed to be slowly, almost imperceptibly, turning. Do not investigate. Some things are best left unfed. My heart hammered against my ribs. What if the bolts failed? What would come through that hatch? Then, a new sound. A heavy, rhythmic thudding against the iron, higher up. Not scraping now, but deliberate impacts. Something was trying to break through the walls themselves. I raced up the spiral stairs, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The thudding was coming from the level just below the watchroom, Elias's old bunk room. The noise was deafening, echoing in the enclosed space. The iron wall on the seaward side was visibly denting inward with each impact. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just scraping anymore. It was attacking. I reached the watchroom, breathless. The lamp still turned, its beam slicing uselessly into the tempest outside. The clockwork ticked, a fragile heartbeat against the storm's fury. The thudding continued below, shaking the floor. Then, a horrific screech, metal tearing, and a section of the bunk room wall ripped open like wet paper. I didn't see what came through. I didn't dare look down the stairs. But I heard it. A slithering, multi-limbed movement on the steps below. The wet clicking intensified. I scrambled up the final ladder into the lantern room, slamming the trapdoor shut and fumbling with the bolts. The glass walls offered no comfort, only a terrifying panorama of the storm and the churning Black Sea. The slithering reached the trapdoor. Something heavy bumped against it from below. Then, scratching. Fingernails? Claws? Trying to find purchase, trying to pry it open. Duty 14, never look directly into the lamp's beam. The beam swept past me, blindingly bright. An idea sparked, born of desperation and Elias's cryptic warnings. Its heart is not for mortal eyes. What about in human eyes? The scratching on the trapdoor became more frantic. I could hear wood splintering. Timing the lamp's rotation, I waited until the beam was facing directly away from the trapdoor. Then, using a heavy wrench from the maintenance kit, I smashed the nearest panel of the lantern room glass. Wind and rain exploded inwards, extinguishing the auxiliary lamps I hadn't even realized were lit. The main lamp, however, protected by its massive lens housing, continued its turn. The trapdoor beneath me buckled, a pale, multi-jointed limb snaking through the splintered opening. I didn't hesitate. As the main beam began its sweep back towards the opening I'd made, back towards the trapdoor, I ducked low, shielding my eyes. The beam hit the trapdoor. There was a sound I can't describe. A shriek, a sizzle, a tearing noise all at once, accompanied by a flash of searing white light that penetrated even my closed eyelids. The smell of ozone and something like burning feathers filled the air. The limb protruding through the trapdoor spasmed violently, then retracted. The scratching stopped. The slithering sounds reversed, retreating down the stairs. Silence, save for the wind whistling through the broken glass and the steady tick of the clockwork. Shaking uncontrollably, I waited. Minutes crawled by. Nothing. Slowly, cautiously, I opened the trapdoor a crack. Looked down. Empty stairs. A gaping hole in the bunk room wall revealed the raging storm outside. Whatever it was gone. Had the light driven it off? Burned it? Elias's words echoed, "Fire is life. Its heart is not for mortal eyes." The light wasn't just a warning system. It was a weapon. And the rules weren't just superstition, they were operational security for that weapon. The salt water wash didn't just clean the glass, it charged it somehow. The foghorn pattern wasn't random, it was a specific sequence, maybe a binding or warding. The lighthouse wasn't just a lighthouse. It was a prison, a fortress, a guard post on the edge of something else. The night didn't just end, it collapsed. The creature was gone, the storm was receding, and I was left alone in the vibrating silence of the lantern room, the wind screaming through the hole I'd made. The beam continued its steady, relentless sweep, but it felt different now. It wasn't a warning light. It was a sword, and I was the hand gripping its hilt. But a sword implies an enemy. I had faced one, but Elias's ledger, it felt like there was more. Dawn broke gray and exhausted. The storm had blown itself out, leaving behind a bruised sky and a still heaving sea. I surveyed the damage. A shattered panel in the lantern room, which I boarded up with spare timber. The splintered, scorched trapdoor. And then, the bunk room. The hole was worse than I thought. A huge section of the outer iron wall was ripped away, the metal bent inward like tinfoil, exposing the cramped room to the open air. Whatever had come through was impossibly strong. And the lower hatch, when I finally dared to check, the heavy bolts were intact, but the iron around them was warped and stressed, the metal groaning softly as if in memory of the assault. Finn arrived mid-morning, his boat pitching in the residual swell. His eyes went wide as he saw the hole in the tower wall. "Christ," he breathed, tying up. "Hell of a storm. Thought you might have washed away." "Almost," I said, my voice hoarse. Mechanism held, though. Light never went out. He grunted, unloading supplies, water, food, kerosene, and crucially, a replacement glass panel, cut to size, and thick iron sheets with a portable welding kit. "Old man always kept them stocked," he muttered, not meeting my gaze. "Said this rust bucket liked to shake itself apart." He expected this. Maybe not the cause, but the damage. Elias had prepared for breaches. As we worked, replacing the glass, riveting the iron patch over the hole in the bunk room, I debated telling Finn what happened. But how? What could I say? Yeah, a multi-limbed horror tried to break in, but I zapped it with the lighthouse beam. He'd think I was insane. "Hear anything unusual during the storm?" I asked casually, handing him a welding rod. He spat tobacco juice over the side. "Just the wind howling like a soul in torment. Same as always out here." He paused, then added, "This place, the sea don't like it. Never has. The rock's got teeth, but the tower, it's got a hunger." Elias knew it. "Best just do the job, son. Keep the light tenant up." He left before dusk, the new glass gleaming, the wall crudely patched. I was alone again, but the solitude felt different now. Charged. Watched. I spent the next weeks in a state of hypervigilance. I followed every rule with religious fervor. But the attack had changed my perspective. I searched Elias's ledger again, this time not for rules, but for an explanation. Why here? Why this tower? The answer, or part of it, was in the final pages, the ones from the last year of his life. His script was a barely legible scrawl, frantic and desperate. He wasn't just afraid. He was guilty. He mentioned feedings, cycles, the long dark. He wrote about the old ones in the Pact. September 5th, cycle nearing its end. Must prepare. The sea grows restless. They hunger. September 18th, feeding was bad. Barely made it back. Light flickered. Must strengthen the wards. The price is too high. October 1st, the long dark approaches. Pact demands its price. Can I pay it again? God forgive me, I cannot. Feeding? What pact? What price? The answer came with the next new moon, during the highest tide of the month. The scraping returned. Duty 11. It started faintly against the lower ironwork, just as the rule predicted. I sat in the watchroom, my knuckles white, telling myself to ignore it. But this time, it was different. Mixed with the scraping, I heard something else. A wet, slapping sound, as if something large was hauling itself onto the rocks below. And then, whimpering. My blood ran cold. It sounded human. Forgetting the rule, forgetting everything except that sound, I raced to the watchroom window. The beam of the light was sweeping, and as it passed over the base of the widow's tooth, it illuminated them. Two figures. Tall, impossibly thin, clad in what looked like glistening black seaweed or kelp that clung to them like a second skin. Their limbs were too long, joints bending at unnatural angles. Their heads were small, featureless, save for pale, luminescent eyes. Elias's vision. Too many limbs. They were dragging something between them, a person, struggling feebly, a dark sack over their head. They hauled their captive towards the base of the lighthouse, towards the shadows directly beneath the tower where the beam couldn't reach. Towards the lower hatch. The scraping from behind the hatch started again, frantic now, a tearing, desperate sound. Duty 11, do not investigate. Ensure the lower hatch is bolted from within. Some things are best left unfed. Unfed. Nausea rose in my throat, hot and acidic. Elias hadn't just been keeping things out. He'd been keeping something in. Something under the tower. Something that needed feeding. The struggling figure being dragged below let out a final, choked scream before being pulled into the shadows. The scraping inside the hatch intensified, turning into a horrific frenzy of tearing, cracking, and wet, guttural sounds. I stumbled back from the window, vomiting into a waste bin. This wasn't a guard post. It was a feeding station. A sacrificial altar. The sounds from below eventually subsided. The two figures emerged from the shadows, empty-handed, and slipped back into the churning sea, disappearing beneath the waves as if they'd never been. The scraping inside the hatch ceased. I didn't sleep. I sat in the watchroom, the cold scale in my hand, staring at the relentless, sweeping beam. How many people had Elias fed to whatever lurked below? Was that the pact? Keep the creature in the dark fed, and the singers, the climbers, the things from the deeper sea, stayed away? The light wasn't just a weapon against the outsiders. It was the lock on a cage. The weight of it crushed me. I couldn't do it. I couldn't be part of this. I wasn't a keeper. I was a monster's butler. Finn's boat was a welcome sight a few weeks later. I'd packed my bags. I couldn't stay. I had to leave. The silence on the boat ride back was heavier than any fog. Every chug of the diesel engine felt like a countdown. I'd packed my bags, just the essentials, leaving Elias's ledger on the desk in the watchroom, open to the last, desperate entry. Let the sea reclaim it. Let the next poor bastard find it. But I knew, deep down, there wouldn't be a next one. Leaving us, then? Finn asked, his back to me as he steered the boat towards the mainland. The shore was a thin, hopeful line of green and gray on the horizon. Can't take the isolation, I lied, the word tasting like ash. It's getting to me. He was silent for a long moment, the boat pitching in the swell. Finally, he spat a stream of tobacco juice into the water. "Isolation ain't what gets people out here," he said, his voice low. "It's the company." My blood chilled. I stared at the back of his withered neck. "What do you mean?" He half turned, his sea glass eyes finding mine. There was no surprise in them. Only a deep, ancient pity. Elias was the fourth keeper in my lifetime. The other two, they didn't last. One jumped from the gallery on a clear day. The other, he just vanished from a locked tower. Ropes were still coiled. Boat was still tied. You knew?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "Nobody knows," he corrected, turning back to the wheel. "Not for sure. But folks on the coast, we've lived here a long time. We know the sea demands a toll. St. Augustine's Reach, it's the toll booth. Elias, he was good at his job. Kept the ledger. Kept the accounts balanced. For 40 years. My stomach turned. The feedings. The pact. He wasn't just sacrificing people to the thing below. He was procuring them. The two figures on the rocks, had they been human once? Or something else, his helpers? The stipend, I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. The preservation grant, it wasn't for the lighthouse, was it? Finn didn't answer. He just kept his eyes on the shore. The money wasn't just to keep the light running. It was payment. Hush money. A retainer for the man willing to feed the beast, to keep the worst things, the singers, the climbers, the things from the deep, at bay. Elias hadn't just been a keeper, he'd been a warden, a zookeeper, and a murderer, all rolled into one, paid for by God knows who to keep the mainland safe. As my feet hit the solid ground of the mainland dock, I expected to feel relief, freedom. Instead, I felt a profound sense of dread, like an invisible chain had snapped, and the resulting twang was echoing out across the water. I felt exposed. I looked back one last time. The lighthouse stood stark and silent against the afternoon sun. I thought I saw a flicker of movement on the gallery, but it was probably just a seabird. Finn was unloading my gear. "Don't look back, son," he said, not unkindly. "What's done is done. The sea, it'll find another way to take its due. It always does." I settled back in the city, or tried to. I got a new data entry job, in a different building, but the hum of the servers sounded like the clockwork mechanism, and the hiss of the air conditioning sounded like the sea. My tiny apartment felt like the watchroom. I couldn't shake the salt from my skin. I found myself obsessively checking coastal news, tide charts, moon phases. Every news report of a boating accident, every missing person report from a seaside town sent a jolt of anxiety through me. I was haunted, not by what I'd seen, but by what I'd done. By what I'd stopped doing. About 6 months after I left, I saw a small article online, buried in the back pages of a regional paper. Historic lighthouse destroyed in freak storm. St. Augustine's Reach. A sudden, violent, and highly localized storm, the article said. No conventional weather patterns could account for it. One local fisherman, I knew it was Finn, reported seeing the sea boil like a pot around the widow's tooth before a wave the size of a mountain rose up and simply erased the tower. No trace of the structure remained. Experts were baffled by the completeness of the destruction. The historical preservation grant was, of course, terminated. Destroyed? Or had the pact been broken? Had the creature below, starved for months, finally broken free? Or had the singers, the climbers, no longer held back by the fed beast and the charged light, finally claimed the tower for their own? I tell myself it's over. I tell myself it's gone, whatever it was, dragged back to the depths with the iron and stone. I try to believe I'm free. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls just right against my apartment window, or when fog hangs heavy in the streets, I think I hear it. Faintly, on the very edge of hearing, weaving through the traffic noise. Singing. And I check the triple-locked bolt on my door. Because the sea is vast, and its secrets have long memories. And some things, once they have your scent, learn to travel. They learn patience. And they are always, always hungry. The dawn that followed was a fragile truce. The storm had passed, leaving the world scoured and still. I spent the morning patching the shattered lantern room glass with spare timber and reinforcing the splintered trapdoor, my hands shaking, every muscle aching with a fear so profound it had become a physical weight. The hole in the bunk room was a gaping wound in the side of the tower, a constant reminder of how easily the walls between my world and theirs could be torn open. Finn arrived late morning, his boat a small, reassuring chug of normalcy against the unsettling calm of the sea. His eyes, usually narrowed against the sun and sea spray, went wide as he took in the gash in the tower's iron flank. Mother of God, he breathed, tying off his boat with practiced speed. Storm hit you hard. You could say that, I replied, my voice a dry rasp. He didn't ask questions. Not the ones I was dreading, anyway. He just began unloading supplies, and I saw he'd brought more than the usual. Thick sheets of iron, a portable welding torch, heavy-duty rivets. It was a repair kit. A breach kit. Elias had planned for this. Finn, it seemed, was part of that plan. We worked in a tense, rhythmic silence, the sizzle and pop of the welder replacing the howl of the wind. Finn was a man of few words, but his movements were economical and sure. As we riveted the final plate over the hole, sealing the bunk room back into its iron tomb, I had to ask, did Elias ever have to make repairs like this? Finn stopped, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a greasy glove. He looked out at the water, not at me. The old man knew how to keep his house in order, he said, the words carefully chosen. Knew that sometimes things knock. Best to have a strong door. He looked at the patch, then at me, his sea glass eyes holding a flicker of something I couldn't name. Pity? Warning? And you kept the light on. That's the main thing. The only thing. He left before dusk, leaving me with a sealed wall and a heart full of unsealed dread. Things knock. The casualness of it terrified me more than the attack itself. This was routine. My relationship with the ledger changed. It was no longer a manual or a journal, it was a testament. But I sensed something was missing. The rules were a how, but not a why. There had to be more. I searched the tower, tapping walls, checking under the floorboards of the bunk, inside the dusty cistern. In the base of the clockwork mechanism, tucked into a recess I'd never noticed, I found it, another book. Smaller, bound in cracked leather, its pages filled with the same spidery script, but this one wasn't a log. It was a confession. Here, Elias laid it all bare. The lighthouse wasn't built by the government. It was built by a secret society, a cabal of wealthy shipping magnates in the 1800s whose ancestors had made a pact with something from the deep. They called them the Singers. In exchange for safe passage for their fleets, for bountiful catches and warnings of storms, the singers demanded a tribute, a foothold, a place to anchor themselves to the land, and a warden to watch over it. The light wasn't a weapon against them all, it was a very specific tool, tuned, like a key in a lock, to repel their rivals, other, more chaotic things that dwelled in the abyss. The scrapers, the climbers, the things the singers themselves feared. And the tribute? It was in the foundation of the lighthouse itself. The tower wasn't built on the widow's tooth. It was built into it, a spike driven into the heart of something that had been chained there long before men sailed these waters. The thing below wasn't a prisoner. It was an anchor, a god. And the pact required it be fed. Duty 11, some things are best left unfed. It wasn't a warning. It was a choice. My choice. The next new moon arrived with a chilling certainty. The tide swelled, high and black. And the scraping began. It was fainter this time, hesitant. Hungry. I stood in the watchroom, the leather-bound confessional open on the desk, Elias's last, scrawled words staring up at me. The pact is blood. The keeper is the hand that spills it. I did nothing. I kept the hatch bolted. I listened as the scraping grew more frantic, more desperate, echoing up through the stone and iron. It was a sound of raw, agonizing hunger. It lasted all night. When dawn came, the scraping subsided, replaced by a profound and expectant silence that felt heavier than any storm. The sea changed after that. The water, once a neutral gray, seemed to take on a darker, oilier sheen. The seabirds, my only constant companions, disappeared entirely. A week passed in this unnerving quiet. Then, on a night of suffocating fog, the pattern of the horn failed. I performed the sequence perfectly, 3 long, 1 short, 7 minutes of silence, but in that silence, there was no distant, ethereal singing. There was nothing. I repeated the cycle. Still nothing. The singers were gone. The pact was broken. I had starved their anchor, their god, and they had abandoned their post. A new sound began. It came from the deep water. A low, resonant thrumming, like a colossal heart beating miles below the waves. It wasn't a sound you heard with your ears, but with your bones. The water around the widow's tooth began to ripple, then churn, despite the lack of wind. The clockwork mechanism behind me faltered. The ticking slowed, became labored. The light beam flickered, its bright arc dimming, turning a sickly yellow. I checked the fuel, the gears. Everything was perfect. But the light was dying. The tower's lifeblood, its very purpose, was failing because the pact it was built to uphold was void. The thrumming grew louder. I looked out the lantern room glass and saw the source. Rising from the black water, vast and slow, were shapes. Not the slender, menacing forms of the climbers, but huge, mountainous things, glistening and ancient. Their forms defied geometry, all knuckled spines and membranous wings that caught the dying light of the lamp. They were the things the singers feared. And now, the keepers of the gate were gone. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. This was it. The end. The consequence of my morality. I ran. Not down, but up. Out onto the narrow gallery surrounding the dying lamp. The wind was still, the air thick and tasting of ozone and deep-sea brine. The colossal shapes were circling the tower, their movements ponderous, inevitable. The thrumming vibrated through the iron rail under my hands. The light inside gave one last, shuddering pulse, and went out. Darkness and silence crashed down. The thrumming stopped. The world held its breath. In the sudden, total blackness, a new light appeared. Below me. Hundreds of them. Pairs of cold, ember-like eyes, igniting in the deep, all turning their gaze upward. Towards me. The scraping started again. Not just from the lower hatch, but from all around the base of the tower. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Climbing. The sound was like a million skeletal fingers scrabbling on a slate roof. I was no longer a keeper. I was the last meal in a house with all its doors blown open. I backed away from the rail, pressing myself against the now dark lantern. There was nowhere to go. The sound was rising, a tide of chitinous clicks and dry, rasping breaths. They were on the walls, on the gallery, their slender, multi-jointed limbs pulling them upward. A face appeared over the edge of the railing. Pale, insectoid, with multifaceted eyes that reflected the faint starlight in 1,000 glittering points. It opened a mouth full of needle-like teeth and hissed, a sound of dry leaves skittering across pavement. I didn't scream. The sound was trapped in my throat, a knot of pure, unadulterated terror. More shapes swarmed over the rail. They moved with a jerky, unnatural speed. I closed my eyes. I thought of a dead-end data entry job in a colorless city, and for the first time, I understood it wasn't a prison. It was a paradise. I felt a cold, sharp touch on my arm, and then another, and another. The last thing I heard wasn't a roar or a shriek from the depths, but the soft, insistent whisper of Elias's words from the ledger, echoing in the ruins of my mind. The sea keeps its secrets. And the sea always, always collects its due.